First to present will be Joe Hotz. He's the Arts and Sciences Professor of Economics at Duke University. He's published papers on a number of topics, including childbearing patterns, labor force participation, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. And he's published in many top journals, including Econometrica and the American Economic Review, just to name two.
This is an awkward title, right? The role of families when children are adults and parents get older. But what I take as the sort of starting point, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, which is that line appears many other places in both the New and the Old Testament. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, and he will be united with a wife. Different language, different text, and the two shall become one. I'm not going to talk about. We've talked about already. They became one and or didn't become one in terms of the marriage. But I'm interested in the leaving part, right? Of people leaving. And as I'm going to show you in a little bit, actually, they don't always leave. But the point here really is about looking at what happens to families as the children become adults, and the nature of the relationship may change, where they live, and the question is sort of how connected they are. Kathleen's going to talk about some of these aspects and also as well about this, how it relates to the aging part. Aging is going to be implicit in what I do, but not a big part of the story. So what I want to talk about, though, is relationships, intergenerational relationships. And I'm going to first talk a little bit about, or review a little bit about at least economic theories or features, motivations from economic theory. I'll talk about what the church teaching has to say about that and some other perspectives as well. And then I want to talk about what we know, and I'm going to tell you what I know because it's going to be based on some work I've done, some with Kathleen, some with other collaborators, about intergenerational living arrangements, because it turns out there's a kind of an interesting feature of the story. You normally think, the kids leave and the nest is empty. Well, actually, it turns out that's not the case. And then I want to talk about the structures, intergenerational structures of American families, sometimes called the extended family, but what I really want to talk about is the fact that both because people live longer and because all the topics we have talked about marriage and divorce, the structures of families are quite different today than they've been in the past. And then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about what economists talk about the nature of these interactions, which are transactions, transfers between the two. In other contexts, right, sociologists and other fields talk about connectedness, and I'll have some things to say about that. And then I want to end with, because we've had a common theme with respect to this, about the relationship between inequality, but in particular I want to talk about what happens to transfers between generations depending upon the wealth, and particularly the parents' wealth. Okay, so let's do the econ part first. This is work with Kathleen, a paper that Kathleen and I wrote with two sociologists, the late Suzanne Bianchi and Judy Seltzer, in which we were trying to sort of bring together the economic ideas about what motivated intergenerational relationships and so-called family ties and economic models. So I want to point out sort of there are a bunch of different traditions in economics, themes about what motivates the interactions between family members. And again, the focus is largely adult children with their parents at this stage. And the first one is sort of a pure notion that comes out of economics, which is thinking about these interactions are just exchanges, right? Just as markets operate and you buy a product from somebody, this is an exchange. And so in thinking about older, sort of people at older ages, I make a promise, with my children, look, you get the inheritance when I die, but you commit to taking care of me in my old age. There are other forms of this, that can take place, but it's kind of very much look like, apropos of the earlier discussion yesterday about, where the term economics come from, of how the notion of the family is kind of like a firm with a set of firms. It's a set of transactions between individuals. Self-interest plays a big role. This is kind of a stereotype of the way people might think economists look at questions. But it's not the only way that people looked at it. I mean, if you look at the work, it was mentioned by Valerie yesterday at Gary Becker's work in the treatise on the family, right? There's very much flavor in that of sort of this notion of, well, some of this relationship is unique and different than the relationship between two parties in an economic transaction, in part because there's a potential for caring and altruism. Precisely what Gary talked about was this notion about that, parents care about the well-being of their children directly. And he defined altruism, and there's controversy about exactly how you define it, but in that notion, the point being, right, that a key part of this is there need be nothing coming back in return for that. If you think about it, that's the story, right, of the parable of the prodigal son. And from an economic perspective, right, the prodigal son becomes a real incentive problem, right? Here you have this parent, right, who goes off, this kid goes off and, sort of completely screws up, and he's welcomed back, whereas the dutiful sons who are continuing to work get nothing out of this, right? We'll come back to that. There's also a notion, Pierre-André Chiappori being really one of the primary movers of this, one of the speakers yesterday, about sort of the thinking about family interactions as repeated games. The notion about repeated games here is there's a repeated set of interactions and you learn about one another. So, who's the person that you spent, up till when you're age, the age 21, who spent most of the time with your parents, right? Even your siblings had less involvement with you if they were born, unless they were a twin, in terms of these outcomes. And you learn about things, and that maybe you learn about these patterns, and that affects, the argument here being that affects your ability to cooperate and engage in behaviors later in life. And so there's a set of game theoretic sort of notions here about that family interactions can be viewed as cooperative games. And the last one is actually more out of genetics and evolutionary biology, but is the thinking of sort of viewing transactions as a way to improve. I'm engaging in transactions to my kids because I want to make sure that my lineage is continued through time. Well, any of those transactions, right? Any of these motivations. Not all unique to economics, have shown up in sort of different models. I'm not really here to talk about so much about those models, but really to talk about how the empirical part. But before I do that, I want to make clear that, right, this issue about how do you deal with, what are the responsibilities when children become adults, right, is also taught, as a part of Catholic teaching here. From the Catechism, as you can see, out of the principle, the commandment, fourth commandment of honor thy father and thy mother, right? But it gets adapted here to sort of take into account reminding, adult children that they have a responsibility to their parents, right? To care for them, as you can see here, to provide them with material, moral support in old age, in times of illness, loneliness, and distress, to be involved in their lives. And on the flip side, right, there are responsibilities to parents and their children. Different slightly than when you're a child at a much younger age, because here the recognition in this passage from the Catholic Catechism is the view that as children get older, parents have a slightly different relationship. They can advise, they can't quite dictate what goes on, but as you can see by the last line, parents can offer judicious advice, particularly as those are planning to start a family. So the nature of the relationship is much more like this notion of we have to bargain over certain things. That's a pejorative term in one sense, but it's an apt one in characterizing this is a relationship that as we age and we become older, it's about parents and children, their adult children, negotiating and interacting, but respecting one another in terms of this principle. One last point about sort of this idea, and that's really out of a news article a colleague of mine who's Canadian sent me a while ago, and it's, let me just get the rest of the slides out here. It's an interesting one in light of sort of this changing economy. This is about China, right? And China has a long history of having great respect for the elderly, historically, right? It's a deep embedded cultural principle. But China's also, over the last 30 years, experienced a rapid economic growth. And that rapid economic growth is viewed as having a consequence for the elderly. And as you can see here, what happened in 2013 is the Chinese government passed a law that said, you're supposed to, I think it's twice a year, you're supposed to twice a year visit your adult children, are supposed to twice a year visit their parents, at least, right? And the other interesting feature about this is if you don't, the parents can sue you. These rights and responsibilities, right, playing out in economic change is kind of an important set of issues. The first thing I want to talk about is summarizing some research that Kathleen and I, with Emily Wiemers and Vladislav Slanchev, two of our former students, right, looking at intergenerational family living arrangements. So the elderly, there's a long-standing tradition of elderly Americans living with their children. In fact, in the beginning of the 20th century, this is pretty common. It became less so after the Second World War, and there's a whole set of issues about why that happened, which I'm not going to go into. But what's kind of in the more recent discussion of this issue it's come up in the context of one of the consequences of the Great Recession is that a lot of kids either didn't move out or moved back in as a result of the difficulties of the economic circumstances. But the part that I want to point out to you is, in fact, since about the middle of the latter part, 1980 in particular, right, there's been a sizable number of adults and older parents living with their adult children, living together, right? And I want to focus on that and how that's happened over the last 25 years. And what I'm going to do, which is a little odd, is I'm going to focus on, in this analysis, we focus on, let's keep track of mothers, right? Part of the reason for this is there's concern about mothers who may be economically disadvantaged. The earlier comments about women who divorce and who's going to take care of them in old age. That's historically been a problem. Kathleen's going to have a little bit more to say about that in a bit. But it's also a way of, we're not excluding the possibility that a husband is present at all, the father of the children, but it's an easier one to keep track of because the other reason tends to be true, as we know, biologically, or at least the phenomena is women live longer. So they're going to be around longer than we men. So I'm going to talk about what means living, 5 categories of situations of characterizing living arrangements that can occur. And I'm looking at this, again, from the mother's perspective, but it's going to tell us a lot about the child. And just so these are the definitions. I'm just going to keep track of living alone. Living alone is a mother and could be with her husband, but she's not living with her children, right? And we're going to see that that's increasingly a common status, and then it goes down. The bottom of the list is nursing homes, which is a phenomenon that Kathleen's, I think, going to talk a little bit more about in this data, and that tends to occur quite late in life. But in between, and the fourth one is you may live with others. Those others may be, in the way we've divided the data, could be grandchildren in multi-generational households. More than 2. But the 2 that we're going to sort of focus on is children. And some of these children in the item number 2 are children who left and then come back, right? They come back for any number of reasons, sometimes economic circumstances, sometimes divorce, they come back in. But then there's also a group that our analysis, I think, has identified as rather unique, right, and not noticed before, which is children who actually we have no evidence they ever left the household. And I want to characterize what these different categories look like. So here's the pattern. Along the horizontal axis, you're just seeing age. So we started out at age 58. That, again, I'm going to date everything with respect to the mother, right? Going through time, and you can see that sort of the black line here is with living with children in general. So this is, at age 58, many children haven't left yet, right? They're still in the household. They're still going into primary and most likely secondary school or college and haven't really left. But as women age, right, that incidence of lowers to, as we can see here, about 20%, but then it stays at 20%. So 1 in 5 mothers are living, when the survey that we're using, which is the panel study of income dynamics, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a minute, we see that they're still living with their parents, out to, as you can see here, age 85. Notice that sort of what happens in the top blue line is women living alone, or again, with their husbands, right? That rises as kids leave the nest, and it goes to the peak, and then it declines, and part of the decline is the relationship that parents tend to live, many parents at later ages go into nursing homes, although that's never a very large phenomena, and usually relatively short stay. But here's the other part. Roughly about half of those, especially once we get out, half of those families who are living with their children, mothers who are living with their children, half of them are children who've gone off at some point and come back to them. And those circumstances, as I said, may be related to economic factors or other dislocations to the child's life, maybe to help mom out. But it's also these set of children who never left. We have no evidence that they've ever moved out of the household. And they're different, right? And I'll tell you why in just a second. So this sets up a pattern. There's a lot of attention to what are we going to do in terms of caring and families caring for their children in old age. And if you think about it, right, you start out, the children are totally dependent. An infant is totally dependent on their parents. And there's a transition, right, at some point which turns around, and the dependence may go the other way, where an elderly person is totally dependent on their family. Hopefully that their children are providing that. So these patterns in living arrangements we see sort of tell us some about that changing patterns of the directions of dependence from child being dependent on parents to parents being dependent on children. And there's kind of three messages that we found in this analysis that go to account for those patterns that I just showed you. First off, as economists, right, you'd think this is true, and it turns out it does. Income matters, right? And particularly, though, it matters differently, and whose income matters, and at different stages of life. Early, for younger parents, right, younger moms, as I refer to here, right, that is, it's just arbitrarily below 70, but whatever age you choose, much of what's, sort of generating the patterns of child and parent living together or parents living alone is about parents' wealth, right? And we know that parents are, parents are going to, at later ages of life cycle, are going to accumulate wealth over that period of time. How much we'll come to in a bit, right, as being an important part of this phenomena. But later in life, that dependence sort of shifts around. It's more that the children's income in particular, but it still matters about what parents do with their wealth. Part of the story here is, in initial stages, right, parents' wealth are an attraction to children, right? Mom and dad have some resources. I can live with them and live much better than I can on my own. Later in life, what income often buys is that living alone, so-called independence. At least that's what the patterns sort of look like. So the notion of income matters, and whose income and what stages of life cycle sort of play an important role in sort of understanding those trends I just showed you before over the life cycle. The second thing has to do with what goes on with these children who never left. It turns out they're disproportionately minorities, and they're disproportionately children who are reporting to have a disability. And if you think about that, right, there's a consequences of this if children never, never leave, right? And the fact, fortunately, that these children with disabilities live longer than they did 30 or 40 years ago, right, is meaning that this dependence pattern, right, of the child being dependent on the parent for these children may never change its direction, right? And as a consequence, there are a sizable 10%, based on our data of mothers and possibly their husbands going into old age, right, will have this dependent child upon them and their provision into the future. This is a big issue. It's a big issue in the context of as the baby boomers retire or can't retire because of the obligations they have for taking care of the children. And then the last part is that, it should be income, but children being, so the economic circumstances do affect this kind of children living with their parents, right? This can come from being unemployed, losing a job, not having much income, so you live with mom and dad, or possibly because of divorce. We look at all these factors. So children's situations are going to affect when you live with your parent, more so as much, if not more so, than is the case for the circumstances of parents. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about this pattern, and just again, I'm going to describe it. What I call the intergenerational structure, or what I'm going to call the intergenerational structure of families. Again, this is sort of joint work with some colleagues. So intergenerationally, American families reflect changes in terms of the structure, the intergenerational structure, due to several things. One, people live longer. As a consequence, they have more opportunity to sort of live with their family. Parents, children, adult children are going to have their parents around longer, right? There's been changes in the nuclear family because of divorce and cohabitation. So the possibility is you have more than two parents, right? Because of divorce, more than just your biological parents. And as a consequence, you may, on the other side, right, have, because of your own marriage and the only possibility of cohabitation and or divorce, children who are not biologically your children, right? And these factors, economic and health factors, are going to affect when children live with you and who moves in and who are going to be there, and what needs or capacities they have to provide help or have need for help in terms of the situation. So all of this is going to affect what's called the strength of ties, which we refer to, are connectedness. And there's a very sort of substantial literature largely in sociology, about the importance of connectedness. It's a very strong predictor, measures of how connected you are, both with your family and with other people. On the flip side, people who are loneliness or estrangement has really important health consequences. For example, people live much longer who are connected. Their quality of life is much higher living through that period of later life when they have these kind of connections. Here we're going to focus on some of those connections, and it turns out, I'm not going to show you in the interest of time all of those results, but we have a number of results showing about sort of what exchanges and interactions occur depend upon the strength of these ties, and those strengths are going to partly depend upon these phenomena of divorce and cohabitation. So here's some basic facts, right? The generation between, and I'm going to think about this way, some of us have elderly parents or older parents, and we have children, and maybe we have grandchildren. We're known as the sandwich generation, right? We're sandwiched between these people, and part of that, the fact that, in my case, my parents aren't alive, but I just last weekend celebrated with my wife my mother-in-law's 90th birthday, right, is an indication of the fact that we have parents around longer now because of life expectancy. And we're going to have children and grandchildren coming along as well, and the structure of those I'm going to show you in just a minute. But here's what you see, right? Men, and I break this up because there are some differences by gender, but not a lot in this particular table, a little bit, which is you see this sort of pattern of what, vast majority of the population still has, and these are people who are between 20 and 75, who have living parents. Now, obviously that goes down with age. The older you are, the less likely you are to have those parents, but there's not much gender difference between that. And increasingly, these people have your parents alive at the same time as you have children alive, at the same time as you have and adult children, which is a distinguishing feature, 18 or over, that have left you, and the possibility of grandchildren. So the structure is there, right, because of life expectancy, for you to have a lot of relatives. I remember when my grandmother lived to 89, quite unusual, right, in that stage of life, and more common was the fact that my grandfather, died. My other grandfather died when he was when he was 70 years old, right? This was in the 1950s, and my own father died when I was 5, right, from heart disease, which fortunately rarely happens today. So here's what you see, right? Well, all I want to show you is the distribution of what happens in families. Go look at your own, you have living parents, right? Here's what you can see, right? 70% of them live with, or have own parents, and they're biologically related, a mother and a father, or maybe just one, just a mother, just a father. But increasingly, right, people have a mother and a stepfather as the parents that they have, right? And it turns out those relationships affect the nature of the transfers between the two generations. Quickly put, as a stylized fact, the explanation of this, and is a separate, the causation part of this is a separate matter. Yeah, those with sort of the strengths of ties are much more based on biology, and the lack of biology, the presence of a step parent, reduces that outcome. Same pattern sort of holds true with respect to the step parents and the nature of their relationships. But it's also the case that increasingly going down the generation, right, that you're going to have, because of the consequences of divorce, right, you're going to have stepchildren. Sometimes your only child will be stepchild. Sometimes you'll have this mix. And as you can see, while the sizable, 2/3, probably 3/4, thereabout of households have only biological children, right, this increasing, 25% is a mix of involving stepchildren presence. Again, if you look at the data, I'm not going to have time to go through it, that has consequences for the nature of interactions between the two generations. Same story perpetuates down to the presence of grandchildren. The point here really is the family structure, combination of living longer, right? Better health in terms of infant mortality, so young people live longer, they're born, they survive. But also the changes that have occurred that we've been talking about over the last 2 days about marriage have consequences for who's going to be there. Who am I going to have to care for? Who's going to be there when I get old to care for me in terms of the, quote, family members that are there. Okay. the last part of this is, gotta remember what I'm doing here. Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of, this is repeating myself. The PSID, let me go back a slide. The Panel Study of Income Dynamics is a study that's been going on in the United States, started in 1968. It started with a sample of 5,000 households. The unique feature of the Panel Study of Income Dynamics is as children became adults and they moved out of the household, they were recruited in to be part of the study. So the study became a genealogical study, right? And that's the data that we're exploiting here. We know about where your children are. In fact, the survey has interviewed them. In 2013, some data that I'm now going to show you, we interviewed them about what they provide to their parents, what they receive from their parents, what do they provide to their children, what adult children, what do they receive from their adult children. And that's the nature of this data. So it's a rather unique data set. In part, the problem is always one of the fact is once, as I said, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, they leave, right? And then as a social scientist, they're hard to keep track of. We go to do a survey, we go to a household, or we call somebody up and we sort of try to ask questions about that. But if your children are off someplace, right, they're not a part of your household, how do we connect them, right? Well, this study is unique in its structure to be able to allow us to do that. This is some stuff about what economists refer to in terms of these interactions. We're going to talk about transfers, and they're going to be about transfers of financial resources, so-called inter vivos transfers, within the lifetime of the parent. Kathleen will come back and talk about some about bequests at the end of life, but also time transfers. So the first part of this about the transfers we measured, we're asking questions like, over the last year, did you receive or provide financial transfers in some, I think the threshold was $500 or more, to your mother, each of your children, or your parents and each of your children, and did you provide time in excess of, and that could have been, for childcare, that could have been because the parent or the child, the parent had health problems, or the child needed, the adult child needed grandma to help take care of the kids, something I and my wife do a lot with our 3 grandchildren, including later on today. And so what I want to show you is some patterns with respect to what happens. I told you in the previous slide that this is about connectedness, and I'm going to not give you, we have a ton of results on this score, but I just want to sort of give you a quick snapshot. Kathleen has some more to say about this, which is the first part of this is, what I'm going to measure is amongst households and then amongst households with parents, what's the nature of the transaction? As you can see, the any column here is about, did one or the other, one generation or the other, engage in any kind of transfer, financial or time or otherwise. We break it out into other pieces, but the point I want to make here, right, is amongst those people who have a household, the news is, 70% of them have some kind of interaction, right, some kind of transfer. As you can see, it turns out that it's more likely it's provided to parents, but that's partly about sort of the age structure. And if you go down, right, to these different patterns, you see the presence of children. Parents and children, adult children, are interacting. They're making these kinds of transfers. There is a connection there between them. It's not, there's the 25% who don't seem to be doing that, but the point here, right, is there is this connection. The families continue to operate later in life. It doesn't say that there are other policy matters which might intervene and affect that, but there is a connection between these people, as here measured by a very limited set of forms of sort of interactions, namely, did you provide some money and did you provide some time or receive some time? The last part of this I want to talk about is these financial transfers and looking at their relationship with parental wealth. And I'm going to ask the question, the theme that's come up about, do these transfers perpetuate or mitigate inequality? So Flavio and Anna's presentations have been focused on the investments of children, of parents to their young children, right? And the whole argument being that those early investments are very, very important for the well-being and development of the children, right? And it's been, as you've seen throughout these last 2 days, a story about inequality, right? Different groups have different amounts of resources. They can do different things for their children in making those investments, both in time, but also in financial resources. But the question that really has motivated a lot of my work of late is asking the question, does that all stop once the kid moves out? Are parents immaterial to sort of that continuing transfer and possibly the continuing perpetuation of inequality? Or do they mitigate later in life? Is it once you're on your own to sort of succeed as an individual, and it's not as much with your parents' help? So does that inequality sort of continue? And this goes very much to the remarks that Pierre-André made yesterday, his concern, and I'm going to show you some of those same concerns here from a different vantage point, namely what happens later in life in terms of the continuing transmission of inequality across resources. I'm going to do that with the following pattern, right? So what's given here is, I referred to this is the same diagram as I showed you before, in the sense of I'm showing you time now, but I'm breaking it out. Time transfers last year and money transfers last year. And you can see here the columns are what percent of, and that's what I'm really going to focus on for much of what I'm going to talk about, the persistent, the patterns with respect to provision of these resources. But the columns here, right, are measures of the wealth of parents. And actually, the PSID is a pretty good set of measures of wealth, net wealth, right? It takes into account their debts. So the bottom 20 percentile, right, the bottom 20% of the distribution, the bottom quintile, right? Most of those people have zero assets, and some of them actually, in the data, somebody has $1 million in debt, right? These were measured post the Great Recession. So some people are sitting there with a lot of debt, but these are mostly people who have no assets, right? They don't own a home, they don't have a retirement account, and that's not even measuring the sort of other possibilities of debt. The top part of this distribution are people who have the top quintile, or the top 20%, right, have resources ranging on median $500,000, right? And they range up to, the highest in the sample is $41 million. So these people are wealthy. It's not exactly Romney's, what was it, 1% or 3%, but we didn't break it that way because we don't have that kind of observation, but these people are wealthier. And what you see here, right, is first look at time transfers. Actually, there's somewhat of an inverted relationship that young sort of people who have less resources give more in terms of time. These are transfers from the parent to their children. We looked at both ways, but I want to focus on this for purposes. You can see it's pretty equal across the parts of the distribution as to how much parents report providing time to their children in terms of helping them. A little more skewed with respect to wealth matters with respect to these time, transfers in money, financial terms last year. Those are sort of short-term kinds of support, but you can start to see there's a pattern. And they give it to more children. And most evidence suggests that, right, wealthier people have fewer children, so this is an indication that more children are benefiting from the resources their parents provide. But here's one we also asked the question, did you help with college education, right? We all know, for many of us in this room, our industry, higher education, has become a much more expensive proposition than it was 30 years ago. Indeed, it's exceeded by several percentage points the rate of inflation over this period. So it's an expensive deal. Even at state universities, it's much more expensive. So we asked a set of questions. Did you help your child, providing them with funds for going to college? We also asked them, did you provide help with going for providing for housing? And here what you see is a very decided pattern with respect to wealth, right? The bottom parts of this distribution are not providing much to their children. They're not providing it to very many of their children. And the top distribution is providing, on average, $20,000 per child, right? Similarly, you're seeing much greater transfers in the form of housing. I want to focus on this one about college because let me go to a flip side. One of the real discussions in the current debate about college education is debt, student debt, that students are taking on to go to college. And especially that's true in a context of the economy, which is only slowly coming back, and these students are not having the kind of resources. This is my last slide. Here's what happens, right? The bottom part of the distribution, almost half of those students have debt, and they range from a mean of $17,000, almost $18,000, up to $500,000. The bottom part of this the top part of the distribution, right? The top 20%. These are wealth of their parents, right? Only 11% of them have debt, and it's a much lower level. Only, on average, $2,700, and even the maximum amount is much lower. So the story here, right, is if you're a child born to a family with considerable wealth, you're more likely to get support for providing it. I provided support to my sons. One went to Notre Dame, one went to Northwestern, not cheap affairs. And neither one of them have student debt. Whereas if you're poor and you even get to college, right, you're more likely now to have debt, and you're less likely to have the support that parents can provide for that. That's the part that's the ominous part of this inequality and the transmission to the next generation. A different form than we were talking about in the earlier talk of Flavio and Anna, but nonetheless an important one. So let me stop there.